this week we are talking about Indian philosophy and different schools of Indian philosophy. Continuing this journey, today I'm going to talk about the Bauddha Dharma, the Bauddha philosophy, or Buddhism as you normally call it. Some of you might remember that previously I have talked about Buddhism, life of Buddha, and the fundamental ideas of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, and the Eightfold Path, all those basics. But just in case if you haven't, you can check those episodes and have some clarity there. But even if you don't, I don't think that will be a problem here. And although I will talk about the foundational principles of Buddhism here, I will discuss the philosophical and the psychological aspects of it and won't go too much into the teachings and the practices that Buddhists follow. So first of all, we have to begin with the idea that the Buddha was primarily an ethical teacher. He was not a metaphysician. He did not really talk about metaphysics. He did not talk about what happens to you after death. He didn't talk about the concept of God, the concept of heaven and hell, all these things. He's mostly rooted in this world, and then he's talking about the suffering, the cause of our suffering, and how we can eliminate it. And while he's silent on the metaphysical questions, his followers often come up with different explanations or interpret his answers in different way, or in some cases, interpret his silences in different ways. But if we purely focus on Buddha's teachings and what he said, we find that he laid great emphasis on the practical matters. And once again to the question of suffering and how we can eliminate that suffering. Another thing worth noting here is even today a lot of people you meet who follow Buddhism or practice certain aspects of it, they will tell you that Buddhism is not really a religion, it's a philosophy. And as I've probably said a lot of times in the previous episodes, that is true for a number of schools of thought in the Indian philosophy. And this is especially true in case of Buddhism because even Buddha, he insists on arguments, on rational thinking, on questioning your beliefs. So he does not say that you should believe whatever he is telling you to believe. Instead, you should inquire by yourself. And whatever conclusions you come to based on your inquiry, based on your own rationality, you should go by that. And perhaps that's one of the reasons it appeals to a lot of modern people like you and I who are rational. And we want rational explanations. So that is the approach Buddha follows. He asks a question, fundamental questions. For example, what is suffering? What is desire? What is an emotion? He gets to the root of it, sometimes through contemplation, sometimes through a dialogue, and then comes up with different answers. And that's why you will find this tradition of dialogues and debates in the Buddhist philosophy or the religion that it has become today. In fact, one of the things that you will notice in history, when Buddhism was the dominant religion in India as well as in China, that there used to be a number of debates among these Buddhist monks and scholars. They used to visit each other from China to India, India to China and other places. And then they would debate on the ideas of life and death and everything in between. And whoever won that debate, that became the dominant narrative for the time being. And this process obviously continued for not just years or decades, but centuries. So, as you can see, what you find today is the refined idea, refined philosophy based on thousands and thousands of debates that these scholars have had. And even then, it leaves a lot of room for contemplation, more debates, more arguments, and which is something we should do. Now, let's go a little deeper here. If you want to understand Buddhism, the core principles of Buddhism, the first thing that you'll have to understand is the idea of impermanence. That nothing in this universe is permanent, nothing is eternal, which is something contrary to the idea of soul or God that you find in other religions. For example, the idea of eternal soul that you find in the dominant schools of Hinduism. But here in Buddhism, the first thing that you have to understand is that the world, the universe, and every element in it is impermanent. It is changing all the time. You must have heard that old proverb which says, you never enter the same river twice, because the river is continuously changing. And that is the idea here. Whichever thing you talk about, whether an object, your own body, your own mind, all the thoughts, or everything that you have in your mind, every little thing, it changes. It's not really the same over a period of time. And then it goes one step further to justify this claim that the reason that you'll always find things changing, because you can never even have a fixed standard. Even the standards will change over time. Now, to understand this scientifically, take anything, any object in this universe. Take your own body. Your cells, as we speak, they are changing. Every atom in your body is changing. It changes all the time. So the person that you were before, let's say a day before or a year ago, it's not really the same person. Now, some of us might argue that there is a soul and that is going to remain same. But that Buddha insists that there is no evidence for that. And even if there were a soul, how do we know it's not changing at all? What is it that is measuring this? And when you meditate and you do this inquiry, you find out that it's almost impossible to put your finger on something and say that this thing is not changing. It's very, very difficult. As I said, the only thing that you can say with conviction, generally two things people argue with. One is your own soul, and the other is the idea of God. In both the cases, the Buddhists will argue that where is the evidence? And that's why it's very hard to counter this point of view. But if even we were to insist that there is God and there is a soul that is not really changing, even then we have to grant that a lot of us, so much inside us, our mind, our body, so much of it is changing. It is changing as we speak. So then we get to this interesting conclusion, and this has a huge impact on our psychology, and which is something Buddhism intends to do. It wants to work on your psychology to alleviate your suffering. So the idea is, when we say that everything is changing, then the concept of I or the self or your own ego, that disappears. And this is something you'll also find in many Sufi traditions. The concept of fana, for example, where you want to destroy the I, to destroy this ego that you have. So what Buddhists are suggesting, it's that what we identify as I, my body, my mind, or even the feeling of I, this feeling of you sitting inside your head and then driving this vehicle, this is an illusion. This is the primary idea of Buddhism. And of course, when you first hear this idea, it's very discomforting, and it can trouble a lot of people. What do you mean, you might ask? What do you mean that I don't exist? How is it possible that I don't exist? But that's why in Indian traditions, you're recommended to contemplate and meditate as you go through these questions. The question of I. And when you meditate, when you ask yourself this question, that who am I? Where am I located? Am I sitting in my head? Am I inside my chest? Where exactly am I? And who am I? Which is really the classic question in philosophy, in religion, everywhere. Who am I? When you probe these questions, you get to that point where it's very, very difficult to define this idea of I. At the most, you can get to a point where you can say you have a spirit or a soul, but that won't be the same thing as we generally define. The thing that is thinking, the thing that is taking actions, that's not really the soul, is it? Soul, even when we define it more in terms of some kind of abstract energy. It's not really a very specific thing, having emotions and thinking. No, we don't define it that way. So even if we were to grant that there is a soul, or if we go by the other logic, the scientific logic or the Buddhist logic, that there is no such thing as eternal soul, in both the cases, whether there is an eternal soul or there is not an eternal soul, in both the cases you'll find that generally what we relate our identity with, the sense of I, the sense of self, it's generally an illusion. Either this self is really, really deep that we are not able to comprehend, or it is not there at all. It certainly is not at the superficial level where we generally think it is, in our brains or inside our head and thinking as a human being. It can't be that. But I would still say, as Buddhists recommend, don't take this for an answer. Just sit and meditate for a long time. Probably it's going to take a lot of sessions. And in case you're not familiar with meditation at all, just sit down and close your eyes and contemplate about this idea that who am I? Ask yourself this. Look for yourself. Where exactly in your body are you located? Are you in your head? If in your head, exactly where? And exactly in what form? Just look for yourself. And then you can proceed with the further questions. So, for now, let's discuss the consequences that it has based on this Buddhist idea that there is no such thing as the self that we identify, and there is no such thing as eternal soul. In fact, everything is changing, everything is impermanent. So, there are two things that you experience when you identify this idea that there is no such thing as the self, or at least the eternal self. The first thing is a feeling of shock, surprise, disbelief. You are unable to digest it, understand it, and at the same time, it can also cause fear in your mind. That if I don't really exist, I'm not going to last forever. It feels very scary to a lot of people. But that's the fear Buddha is talking about here. When we have attachments, when we have this idea of self, inevitably we are going to have fear. And inevitably we are going to suffer because we want to hold on to things. We want to cling on to something, to find identity, which is not really there because there is no permanent self. And because sooner or later we are going to find this out, we are going to lose things in our life, probably our loved ones, certain things in our possession, and eventually we are going to lose our life. And that fear is almost always there in a lot of people. So according to the Buddha, the cause of that fear, the cause of this suffering is exactly this. Our false sense of identity and our unwillingness to see the truth. And in fact, once you recognize it, once you accept it, this feeling is quite liberating. First, it's scary for sure, but then it's quite liberating. And that's where Buddhism wants you to take you to. Where you don't see yourself as a thing, but as a being. And what is being, you might ask? Being is a process. It's not a thing. It's in the living. It's in the continuity. So you continue. You change, but you continue. And it is in this sense Buddhism talks about the idea of rebirth. It does not talk about in the sense that you have a soul and that soul is migrating from one body to another. But it gives different examples. For example, suppose there are clouds and then they become rain. The rain goes into the rivers and oceans, and that same water gets vaporized and turned into clouds. So when this thing is happening, this change is taking place, for example, clouds are turning into rain, would you call it the death of clouds or birth of rain? Or it is simply a continuous process of changing one thing into another. And it's ever going. This never stops. Because change is the only constant. That's what Buddhism teaches you. Because how Buddhism sees the matter, this universe, it's in very simple terms. According to Buddhism, whatever object, whatever matter you have, it is interacting with the rest of the universe all the time. And the moment it interacts, it changes. So anything that is interacting, it is changing. So basically, anything that exists, it changes. And then anything that doesn't change, it means it doesn't exist. So that's why this idea that everything is changing all the time, we are changing, we are falsely and mistakenly getting attached to one form, the form that we are in right now, and based on that we are suffering. But we don't have to suffer, because we have to identify that this is not the form that we've always had. At one point, the constituent matters came together, they formed us, and eventually they'll form something else. This will go on, this will never stop. Today you are sitting in your room, tomorrow or at some point you might get scattered in the earth or in the air or water, but you go on. And that's the Buddhist idea here. You go on. You've always continued in different forms, and you will continue to exist in different forms. Your forms will change. That is all. So even if we were not to go to that extent, that everything is sort of changing all the time and there is nothing eternal in this universe, we can still learn some important lessons from Buddhism. It is that we are suffering because we usually get attached with certain false ideas, false images of those things in our head. And when they don't meet our expectations, we end up getting hurt. It can be true in case of friendships, because you might have certain idea of a friendship in your head, and over a period of time your friendship is going to change for sure, your friend is going to change. And then you might feel at some point that you are being let down by the other person, by your friend. So that will lead to suffering. It can happen in not just in relationships, but with the material possessions as well. We might want to hold on to our possessions, our money, job, security, everything. But these are not permanent. We are just holding on to them and making ourselves miserable in the process. It's okay to let them go. And once again, all these things are really easy to say, very hard to practice. And that's why in Indian philosophy, you are encouraged, as I said, to meditate, to follow certain practices along with the theoretical philosophical part. So let's say when we want to understand this idea of impermanence, that everything is changing and we shouldn't be holding on to it, you should also be meditating on impermanence. And you'll find those meditations easily available everywhere. One meditation could be on impermanence. One could be on the idea of death. One could be on relationships and their impermanence, their nature. So you'll find meditations on all these ideas. You meditate upon them and then you understand them better. So if you do that, if you meditate, if you contemplate and see these things clearly, and at the same time, you don't have to be dogmatic, you don't have to believe whatever Buddha says, just be rational and objective. Ask questions, satisfy your curiosity, and eventually you'll find your answers. And most importantly, as Buddha suggests, whatever answers you find, you should test them. Put all those answers into test. And if those answers turn out to be true in practice as well, then only you should accept them, not before that. So, with that, I'm leaving you with a lot of homework.